we won in the end. You thought you'd won. You guys from the cities, from the coastal areas, you thought you were better than us. But actually, we're very proud of our cowboy hats, our leather boots, our big belt buckles.
Music videos looking something like this and sounding a bit like this are everywhere in Brazil. Agronejo is a relatively new genre of music from Brazil. It mixes funk and hip-hop, and there's a lot of country. And the music videos show farmers with cowboy hats. They've got expensive watches and they're sitting on these bling tractors, and they're getting millions of views online. But behind the boots and the beats, critics say that this isn't just music. They say that the farming industry is using Agronejo to paint an idealized vision of agriculture in Brazil and to distract from its environmental impact. So that's what we're going to be digging into today, the rise of Agronejo and what it says about culture, climate change, and the Brazilian countryside. I'm Hannah Gelbart, and this is What in the World from the BBC World Service. And here with me in the studio to talk about this is Marco Silva, a BBC climate disinformation reporter. Hello, welcome back.
Hello, very glad to be back.
So you've done a documentary on this subject, but to start off with, can you tell me a bit about Agronejo, what the style is like and where it comes from, when it started to become big?
So Agronejo is less than a decade old, so it's a quite recent genre, and it draws inspiration from sertanejo, which many people may be aware of, is the traditional country music in Brazil. Sertanejo is and has been hugely popular across the country. It's still the most streamed, most played genre across radio stations in Brazil. Sertanejo musicians would have acoustic instruments, have a certain melancholy to their music, a lot of songs about relationships. What Agronejo does is draws from that inspiration, that celebration of the countryside, of a rural life that was visible in sertanejo, and gives it a modern twist. So it combines that music style with pop, electronic, Brazilian funk, more modern influences targeting a younger audience. And this blend of the old and the new is also translated into the visuals. So where sertanejo musicians used to, appear with white shirts or jeans, their guitars, cowboy hats,
accordions as well. They love an accordion and a triangle.
That is true. So the Agronejo musicians, they still have the cowboy hats, the big belt buckles, the leather boots. They are still there, but then they bring all these visual clues that you would perhaps associate to other music genres. For example, all the bling that you'd see in hip-hop is very visible in many of these music videos, the sports jerseys as well. So I interviewed one of the biggest names in the genre. It's a musical duo called Os Agroboy. They started working in 2021, and they have since then become one of the biggest names within the genre.
For a long time here in Brazil, anyone who wore boots and hats in the big city was seen as bizarre, the butt of a joke. Not anymore. Today, people are proud of being from the countryside, and we really represent that movement.
In the case of Os Agroboy, they have millions of followers on streaming platforms. Their videos...
75 million views I saw on one of their YouTube videos, 50 million on others.
That's right. So big numbers on social media as well. So when you ask them who are the people who normally listen to your music, they will say, well, we're very popular in the interior. Brazil, as you know, is a huge country. The interior, a huge population there who turns to this music as an expression of who they are.
The interior is basically all that is not on the coast.
Exactly.
And that is most of Brazil. I'm fascinated by this rural idyll, this idealization of rural life, and that's one of the main themes in this music. And it's almost as if, like, with modernization and the rise of urban life in Brazil, people moved, towards a more urban ideal, and it taps into this big divide that's in Brazil right now between people living in the interior, the rural life, and the urban and coastal way of life. Can you tell me a bit more about that divide and the role of farming in it?
This divide is a very big theme in Agronejo songs. It's something that comes up very often. What Agronejo does is grabs that feeling and says, you guys, the so-called city playboys, which is a very strong image that appears in many Agronejo songs, the so-called city playboys, you laughed at us. You used to laugh at us. You looked down on us. You thought we were worthless, but look at us now. Using farming, using agriculture, we managed to turn a small piece of land into wealth. We are now big landowners. We own property. We have tractors. We have clothes. We have the girls, and we won in the end. You thought you'd won. You guys from the cities, from the coastal areas, you thought you were better than us, but actually, we're very proud of our cowboy hats, our leather boots, our big belt buckles.
It's like a rags to riches narrative.
Absolutely.
But there are critics who say that Agronejo isn't just about music, it's actually marketing. Why is it that some people think that?
So it's complicated. The critics of Agronejo say that fundamentally what Agronejo does is it provides a highly curated, idealized, ideologically motivated version of what the agricultural universe is. They say it provides a sanitized image of agriculture that doesn't take into account any of the negative stuff, right? And that promoting this image of the agricultural industry in Brazil is useful from an economic point of view, because the more positive the image is, perhaps from a political point of view, more open people will be to supporting laws and regulations that are favorable to the industry and to the business, which of course, is highly disputed by the musicians that are part of the genre and the companies themselves who support the musicians.
Well, how independent are the musicians from the farming industry?
So it's important, before I answer that, I think it's important to just reflect a little bit on what the links are between them. So when I asked, for example, Zagroboy where they perform most of the time, they said most of our shows happen at rodeos, which, by the way, are hugely popular in Brazil. It's something that I didn't know when I first approached the story. They perform very often in rodeos, in trade shows for the agricultural industry. Likewise, if you look at the music videos on YouTube for some of these musicians, not all of them, but you'll see that in some cases, these videos are sponsored by companies. So at the very beginning, rather than having a YouTube ad, you would have the logo of the company saying this music video was sponsored by this particular agribusiness company. What the critics say is, well, by sponsoring the shows, by sponsoring the videos, effectively the industry is channeling money into a genre that they perceive as useful. On the other hand, the companies themselves would argue that sponsoring musicians or events that are linked to their business or that are linked to their consumers is just good business, right? They will endorse musicians that can showcase their products because, well, guess what? The people who will watch the music videos might want to buy the tractor that they see on a video of an Agronejo musician, for example.
So we know that farming makes up a huge amount of Brazil's industry. I think it's about 22% of its GDP, according to the World Bank. But what's the environmental impact of agriculture in Brazil?
So to answer that, it's important to understand that Brazil is, according to data, Brazil is the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gases around the globe. Greenhouse gases, of course, we're talking about carbon dioxide, methane, and essentially the gases that are causing climate change. With that in mind, 2/3 of the emissions of those gases in Brazil can be linked to agriculture and changes in the way land is used. And that means essentially deforestation. And data also shows that in some parts of Brazil, like the Amazon, up to 80% of the deforestation in the Amazon can be linked to agricultural activities. So fundamentally, we're talking about chopping down trees to create land for crops or to create pasture for livestock. Deforestation is a problem for a couple of reasons. So, on the one hand, trees act as a great way to deal with climate change in that they absorb carbon dioxide. So, when we chop trees, when trees are, brought down to release land for agriculture, effectively what happens is that carbon dioxide, either because the trees are burned or because they just decompose, that carbon dioxide is again released into the atmosphere. All the carbon dioxide that had been stored in the tree is released again into the atmosphere, further aggravating the problem of climate change.
You mentioned that this music has been called quite selective in the vision that it shows of rural life in Brazil. When it comes to that selectivity, what is it missing out? What's being omitted here?
What the songs do is portray the business as this way of making farmers' lives amazing, right? Do engage with this industry, and you'll get the wealth, you'll get the land, you'll get the tractors, you'll get all these perks. And isn't it amazing? Agriculture, as it is often said in the songs, is the economic engine of Brazil, is what is really driving Brazil. But as you said, what is not featured is perhaps what, again, some academics, some critics describe as the darker side of the industry. And this could be the environmental impact, the impact that it has on climate change, the links to poor working conditions, precarious work, land grabbing, the impact that it's had on the indigenous peoples of Brazil. So all of these aspects are simply not mentioned in the songs. And I took my time. Of course, I didn't listen to every single Agronejo songs, but of all the time that I spent listening to these songs, I couldn't find a single song that reflected on these points.
What do the artists themselves say about these criticisms? Have they responded to them?
Yes, so I took the chance to put some of that criticism to Os Agroboy specifically. I asked them whether they felt that the portrayal of the agricultural sector in their lyrics, whether they felt that it was accurate and complete.
É totalmente fiel à realidade porque
It is completely faithful to reality because what drives Brazil today is agriculture. It is the rural worker who gets up early, plants soybeans, and harvests coffee.
And when I put to them the accusation, an accusation that I've heard from some of their critics, that effectively what Agronejo musicians more widely are doing is spreading propaganda, which is a very heavy word for this industry, they again rejected that idea. They said, just look at the name of our duo.
Our name is Os Agroboy. We don't need to do paid propaganda, we do it for free. We celebrate agriculture, we're from the countryside, we don't need to be paid to do this.
It's important to say that when I spoke to one of the leading industry bodies in Brazil about this, an association called the Brazilian Agribusiness Association, and they said that agriculture is part of Brazilian culture. They say supporting cultural manifestations such as Agronejo makes sense. It's a legitimate way of acknowledging and strengthening that part of our identity. They say that Agronejo, like any other cultural expression, can't offer all perspectives. It offers one. But of course that the debate should still be happening.
Marco, I'm going to be listening to a lot of Agronejo this weekend, and I'm going to be paying a special attention to the lyrics because now I understand the deeper perspective, the debate that's actually going on underneath the surface.
Absolutely, as you should.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, drop us a comment below. You can also find us on WhatsApp. We're on Instagram at BBC What in the World. I'm Hannah Gelbart. This is What in the World from the BBC World Service, and we'll see you next time.